Hello and welcome to India Speak, the podcast by CPR, the Center for Policy Research. I am Sushant Singh, Senior Fellow at Center for Policy Research. This series of podcasts features leading global experts and academics on the many facets of Sino-India relations. Some of them have looked at the strategic side of things, while others have focused on the military facets. But today, we will be discussing the historical and political aspects, looking at contemporary China and its relationship with India through that prism. And to do that, our guest today is a top scholar of modern, international and global history with a specialization in the history of Eastern Asia since the 18th century. Professor Arne Westad is the Elihu Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University, and he first went to study in China as an international exchange undergraduate student in 1979. In the first part of his career, he was mainly preoccupied with the history of the Cold War, China-Russia relations, and the history of the Chinese Civil War and the Chinese Communist Party. Since the mid-2000s, Westad has been concerned with more general aspects of post-colonial and global history, as well as the modern history of China. Currently, he is mainly interested in researching histories of empire and imperialism, first and foremost in Asia, but also worldwide. He's also trying to figure out how China's late 20th century economic reforms came into being and how their results changed the global economy. Westad joined the faculty at Yale after teaching at the London School of Economics, where he was school professor of international history, and at Harvard University, where he was the St. Lee Professor of US-Asia Relations. He is a fellow of the British Academy and of several other national academies. He has authored 16 books, which have been translated in more than a dozen languages and have won numerous awards, including the Bernard Schwartz Book Award and the Bancroft Prize. His seminal work, The Cold War, A World History, was published in 2017, a new history of the global conflict between capitalism and communism since the late 19th century. It provides the larger context for how today's international affairs came into being. His forthcoming book is about China in the 1970s, the decade that put the country on the path we see today. Arne, welcome to India Speak.
Thank you very much, Sushant. As always, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Arne. Same here. Let me start with a question everyone asks you as a historian of the Cold War about this description of this new Cold War, which many people say this competition and confrontation between the United States and China is. From India, where I'm currently based, that is the description one hears often, though not officially. How true is that description, and how is it similar to the Cold War, and how is it dissimilar to the Cold War?
I think that there are more differences than similarities. I mean, look, these kinds of comparisons are only useful from a strategic perspective when they make sense in terms of actual policy making. And I think that's why we run up against some difficulties with regard to the Cold War. So the Cold War was, a global system of conflict between ideologies, very different versions of how the world should be run on everything from, political theory to practical economics. And it doesn't seem to me that the rivalry between the United States and China is of that sort. Now, the biggest differences, and these are important for India, I think, are that, China operates quite happily within a globalizing capitalist world system of economic exchange, and have actually benefited from it tremendously. It's also true, I think, that if you look at the Chinese perspective on things and even the US perspective of things, even if these are now and are going to remain, I think, for some time, the most powerful countries within the world system, it's not a bipolar world. I don't think either of them actually believe that that's the direction that we're heading in the longer run. And I certainly don't believe it. I mean, the overall trend in international affairs now, and I don't really need to tell this to an Indian, is not towards increased bipolarity. It's towards some form of multipolarity. And the big question for us is how stable will that return to multipolarity in global affairs actually be? So these are the differences in a way from the Cold War. There are some similarities as well. I'm not saying that there is nothing we can learn from the Cold War as an international system. I'm just saying that the international system we seem to me to be heading towards is substantially different from the challenges that we faced during the Cold War.
Arne, if this new Cold War descriptor is mostly not true, or there are major differences from what the Cold War actually was, Are we in the danger of making this a self-fulfilling prophecy by invoking it again and again? You have heard the Chinese scholars and officials use this term, comparing today's United States to the last days of the Soviet Union. What should we really make of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not so preoccupied really with the self-fulfilling prophecy or aspect of this, although it can constrain decision makers' thinking, particularly those who are not really all that au courant with history, the way it actually played out. I'm more preoccupied with how it can limit our choices. That were quite a few dangers we don't see. Because when you say that this is not a new Cold War, that's not all positive. The Cold War, after all, didn't end in cataclysmic global warfare, right? Well, a lot of earlier rivalries on a global scale actually have. But I also think that, this idea that is pretty often seen in history, that policymakers and generals are preparing to fight the last war, that there is a bit of a danger there. I think one needs to take a cold and hard look at realities, the way they have been developing now with regard to China's rise, and draw policy inferences from that, particularly strategic inferences for the medium term and long term future. So that's a danger I see with using a simile that really doesn't work all that well. It can even, as I think it sometimes does, particularly maybe in smaller countries, lull you into some kind of false sense of security with regard to this, because the Cold War was, after all, a relatively stable international system. I'm not sure that this system is going to be anything like as stable as what the Cold War was.
Arne, you almost seem to advocate that we should be relieved if it is a Cold War, because otherwise the other option is going back to the early 20th century, and what we saw in the late 19th and early 20th century. That was the period of instability because of multipolarity. Is that what you're hinting at?
Yes. I see more similarities between the world we seem to be heading towards now in the late 19th century than I see, at least in a direct sense, between what we are observing now and the kind of situation that we had, particularly during the mature Cold War system. So from the mid 1950s and up to the late 1980s. And as you quite correctly observed, Sushant, that's not all positive. We know how that rivalry ended. So managing multipolar rivalries, I think, is what we need to be thinking about now. And we're not really, conceptually or perceptually well prepared for that, because we come out of a very long period in which power on a global scale was, with a great deal of correctness, I think, in terms of the approach, regarded as bipolar, and then a brief unipolar moment in terms of US power that followed that. So it's a long time since we've seen that kind of system, and we're not really very prepared to manage it.
And Arne, why do some Chinese officials or academics or experts, say that this current period reminds them of the last days of the Soviet Union when they look at the current United States? Why do they say that?
First and foremost, in terms of overreach, that the United States has been trying to do too many things in too many areas, starting with the 1990s, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that it doesn't have the potential, the economic and internal political stability that is needed in order to fulfill that kind of broad agenda. That's the reason why an increasing number, you're absolutely right about this, an increasing number of policy advisors, including people I know well, in China, are drawing these kinds of parallels. That's not the same thing as saying that they believe that this will be a rerun of the Cold War, but it's just pointing out, and I think to some extent they're right about this, some similarities between what the Soviets got terribly wrong towards the end of the Cold War and what the United States have been engaging in over the last 2 decades.
And nobody has studied Soviet Union or the demise of Soviet Union better than the Chinese. They've been obsessed with it.
Yeah. There is almost a national, or certainly an inner party, in a communist party obsession. That is the right term, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And again, for understandable reasons. It's very interesting, this, because it started out as being a sort of Communist Party like-for-like comparison, right? They were preoccupied with this because they were afraid that communism in China would suffer the same fate as communism in the Soviet Union. And then gradually, as China, faced a lot of problems, but not necessarily the same ones that the Soviets came across in their last decade, the construction of the parallelism seemed to go in the opposite direction towards the United States. And thinking maybe we are seeing a shift on a global scale where the remaining of the two superpowers is running into some of the same problems as the former Soviet Union did towards the end of its existence. So let me just say, for the sake of the overall framework here, Sushant, that I don't agree with that analysis. But it's interesting to see that some Chinese increasingly are drawing that comparison.
Arne, you first went to China in 1979, more than 4 decades ago. What is it since then that has remained unchanged about China? Because China has changed so much. And what has changed significantly, something which strikes you very, very obviously? And, I'm particularly trying to refer to something like the Chinese nationalism. Does it still remain the same, or has it changed? And why I'm curious about this, because you have a view of the Chinese economic reforms and what happened in the last 4 decades, which is very different from the very popular view that goes around. Because you have written about it, you've stated it, that it was to create a very strong state to prepare itself against the fear of the Communist Party losing out, being eradicated by the West, and so on and so forth. So what has really remained, what has changed, and what has remained unchanged in China that strikes you immediately?
Well, it's far easier, Sushant, to talk about what has changed, because most things have changed, right? When I first arrived in China in the late 1970s, it was a dirt poor and terrorized society, right after the Cultural Revolution, where people inside their own homes were deadly afraid of what the government could do to them, sort of day to day. People were hauled away and sent to labor camps or executed for very little reason. So, in that sense, from a Chinese perspective, surely the changes, the progress has been immense, and it's mainly been positive. And I would agree with that. China is not only immeasurably richer, but it's also much freer in terms of people's day-to-day behavior than what it was, more than 40 years ago. Nationalism has increased massively. I'm not even sure back in the 1970s if you can speak of a Chinese nationalism in a sort of narrow sense. I mean, there were some elements of it, but it was still a sort of civilizational or cultural, or for that matter, imperial kind of thinking about themselves and the outside world. That has changed. I mean, today it's about what it means being Chinese, and being Chinese means being what they prefer to call Han Chinese, right? So it's an ethnic definition of what it means to be Chinese. It's as the Germans would have said, prior to 1914, it's the Blut und Boden version. It's the blood and land, blood and soil version. So obviously that has changed quite a bit. But I mean, what has changed most, of course, is China's pure capacity. I mean, this is the greatest period of economic growth and transformation that any country has gone through in history. I mean, even if we compare it to the United States and before that, Great Britain, this is happening on a scale that is entirely unprecedented, and with a speed that is entirely unprecedented. And that's, of course, the biggest change with regard to this, that a lot of Chinese leaders, including President Xi, have now concluded that China has arrived, that this is China's moment. It's not about what's going to happen in the future anymore. It's that China has risen. Not on everything. I mean, there is more uplift and rise to do, but it has arrived as a global power and as by far the strongest power within its wider region. And that region, as you will be aware in the Chinese mind, runs from the Persian region, areas east of Caucasus, and all the way to Korea, Japan, and Indonesia. So, it's a pretty large region, and that's where their focus is going to be, and that's where the current Chinese leadership is determined to be the preeminent power.
And Ani, a bit about the economic reforms and how do you see it as being different from what the popular narrative about Chinese economic reforms and the trajectory that it took is?
So I think you already alluded to this, Sushant. The start of the economic reforms was, of course, entirely about rescuing the party from its own disasters in the past, from the Cultural Revolution, from the very negative economic effects of the first 2 decades, almost 3 decades of Communist Party rule, and move it in the direction of economic growth for the sake of rescuing the one-party dictatorship. This wasn't about markets and international interactions and capitalism, the use thereof, for its own sake. It was about making China rich and strong and thereby allowing the political system to survive as a dictatorship unchallenged. Now, it hasn't been unchallenged, we've seen that, but overall the operation has succeeded. And that's what Xi Jinping is drawing the benefits from now, internally within China, in the sense that his legitimacy comes out not of the correctness of Marxist-Leninist propositions about how to rule society and build a party. It comes out of the successes of economic growth and the trickle-down effect that there has been of that to most Chinese, not all. China still has a massive poverty problem, as you know, in some provinces. But it also has a vast middle class with a buying power that is, similar to the least developed areas of the European Union, and moving on from there. I wouldn't be surprised if within a decade, the Chinese middle class, which probably now is about 700 to 800 million people, would have a buying power that would come very close to the European average. And that is a remarkable effect of this. But we just shouldn't kid ourselves into believing that this is undertaken simply for the general welfare of the Chinese people. It's undertaken to keep the party in power.
You mentioned President Xi, and I wanted to ask you about President Xi, who is seen as this very powerful dictatorial figure, alone controlling everything. There's great media interest in him. Western media, international media features stories about President Xi and what he's like. But you have pushed back against that understanding, arguing that China is a party dictatorship and not a personal dictatorship. The phrase, if I'm not wrong, that you have used is that Xi represents the party's consensus view taken to the extreme, a view of the party elite that existed even before he took over. What is the significance of this view and how should we look at it? For a country like India, what does it really mean?
I do think that this is important. I mean, this tendency that you see particularly in the West and maybe particularly in the United States of personalizing most things, and in this case, personalizing the Chinese dictatorship to just be about Xi is, in my view, entirely wrong. It's even to some extent dangerous because it assumes that if there is a change in leadership, China would go in a very different direction. That's not true under the current circumstances. I think there is a consensus view, and which is very, very close to the one that President Xi represents. I also think that in terms of how policy is formed, that this is not a personal dictatorship. It very much comes out through discussions and debates at the higher ranks of the party. Xi is definitely, the first among equals in the Politburo Standing Committee. But he needs to consult with that group and with the full Politburo. We are seeing that now. I just heard from Beijing that they spent a lot of time inside the Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound, with their advisors now discussing Ukraine and what should be the Chinese policy in case of a Soviet invasion or even significant incursions into Ukraine. So this would not have been the case if this was a personalized dictatorship where Xi would make all the decisions. And I think it's important to be aware of this if you think India. For many reasons, the most important one is that one has to pay attention to Chinese policymaking and try to figure out as much as one possibly can about it. I mean, that all of this is down to the whims of one dictatorial ruler is a dangerous proposition, because then you can easily get locked into never-ending truths that may actually turn out to be wrong if the policymaking process in China goes in a different direction. So it's a sort of behold and beware kind of exhortation really on the Indian or US side.
Arne, you mentioned Soviet Union invasion of Ukraine. That's a historian speaking, because it's now Russia, not the Soviet Union.
Right.
Not the Soviet Union.
Indeed. This is what the mind is full of.
Coming to the ongoing border crisis with India, which has gone on for now last 21 months, what to your minds are the driver of this crisis from the Chinese side? And I'm asking you this because, we've discussed this earlier when we met at New Haven, because top PLA officials have been complaining to you about India even before this particular crisis began in the spring of 2020. What exactly is their complaint from India? What is their view of India? What have you heard from Beijing and from the PLA?
This is where I think we first have to take a step back in terms of the overall Chinese, meaning Chinese Communist Party, understanding of India as a country in terms of its origins and its historical role. I think the main point here does go back to the 1940s and early 1950s, where it was really hard for the CCP, then just having come into power itself, to start thinking about India as an independent actor, to its south and to its west. The idea that India was somehow still beholden to, still connected to British imperialism was very, very strong in China. And some of these attitudes have been handed down in quite a remarkable way. We have talked about this before, in terms of at least coming right up to the current generation of leadership. I mean, not that many years ago in private conversations when I was, and this was not a sort of construct, but it came from the heart, I think, with some of my Chinese interlocutors. They were wondering, what kind of country is India? How is it more? One of them said, I don't think this is. Let me preface this by saying, Sushant, I don't think this is true for that whole generation of Chinese policymakers, but I remember clearly one of them asking me, is India really a country? Or is it something that is put together, by British imperial expansion, a kind of haphazard post-colonial concoction? I don't think that is the majority view among Chinese policymakers, but as a starting point, that kind of doubt, between doubt and puzzlement, is something that I think it's important to be aware of when you then look at India's tremendous successes in keeping, not only keeping its national integrity in order, but also in terms of developing its political system and its economy. I think that's something that the Chinese do not fully understand. The Chinese leadership does not fully understand. Now, with regard to the PLA, I think, of course, this goes back to the 1962 war, and it goes back to the kind of strategic thinking that the PLA leadership has had in a broad sense about China's border areas. So there was this sense that with regard to India, that, as the predictions of Indian weakness, which I think came out of 1962, did not fully hold up, right? I mean, particularly when you get closer to our own time, that more attention needed to be paid to the border areas and to potential conflict with India. And you've seen this particularly over the past decade. It's quite obvious that there are some parts of the PLA leadership now for two generations of top leaders within the Chinese military who have been very deeply preoccupied with Indian affairs, been very preoccupied, with the relationship with Pakistan. Beyond, I think, what you should imagine if there had been a clear understanding on the Chinese side of the role of India, that it should have been called for. Now, you could turn this around, as you know well, Sushant, to say that, if that is the case in parts of Chinese policymaking, it's of course even more the case in India in terms of a preoccupation with, and sometimes even an obsession with relations with China. So this goes in both directions. But it's important to be aware of this broader background, I think, for the relationship.
So the complaints which you hear from the PLA about India's attitude, India's approach, are they flowing out of this construct that you mentioned of the prism that they see through, the imperial prism, that India is a handmaiden of Western imperialism, or as Mao used to say, Nehru is a running dog of British imperialism or Western imperialism? Is it because those complaints are flowing out of the construct, or are those complaints totally different in nature? Are they more tactical, more operational in nature?
So the funny thing here is that they are both. I mean, they come out of that deeper background. Even some of the vocabulary refers to that deeper background. But of course, they're also connected to what the Chinese leadership, and particularly its military leadership, sees as possible and desirable in the relationship to India. I mean, these two can easily go together. I think what makes it problematic from a Chinese perspective is that these constructs, these ideas of a weak Indian state, preoccupied with its internal development troubles for a very long period of time, and maybe not being cohesive enough to carry out a sustained strategy in foreign policy, never mind military terms, that has turned out not to be true. And I think that's one of the challenges from a Chinese perspective, is to get one's head around that. That India now is a real rival in these broader regional terms that I pointed out, and perhaps the main rival, right, within this region. So if the Chinese aim is, for broader strategic reasons, to become the predominant power within this very large Eastern Asian region, well, it's hard now, I think, in a realistic sense, from a Chinese perspective, not to draw the conclusion that perhaps the main hindrance on the way there too is India, more than any other country, particularly if you believe, as these people do, in a gradual US decline, and that Japan is not going to step up and be a regional rival to China. And if you then hope, as they do, that their relationship with Russia will continue to improve along the lines that we've seen recently, that only leaves India. And it's very important from an Indian perspective to be aware of that. That's not necessarily something I'm saying to predict endless conflict between China and India in the future, but it is very important, I think, that, for many Chinese policymakers, the attention to India has turned. So I used to joke in the past that, maybe a decade ago or 15 years ago, especially when I was in Delhi, that, in Beijing, not all that much thought was given to India, and that on the Indian side there was this almost obsession with China and with China's growth, and there was a disparity in terms of foreign policy making as a result. Well, that's not true anymore. I mean, that is one of the changes that we talked about. Now there is considerably more attention to India in Beijing, much more than I have ever seen before in the time when I've been visiting the place.
Speaking of this, what can India now do to deal with China? China is still India's biggest trading partner, and by a long way. That is a dependency which is not going away. The Quad seems to be, one of India's options, but it is irking China. India's delicate balancing act between Russia and the United States is also, is a tricky one, very hard balancing act to perform, to follow. And as the largest Chinese neighbor, biggest Chinese neighbor, it is under serious pressure. Arne, what would you advise to Mr. Modi if he calls you up? Other than, I know that you would advocate strengthening of internal democracy in India. Other than that, what would you?
I would certainly emphasize that one of India's main strengths is its functional democracy, its freedom of speech, its ability to move. And this is one of the things that has really surprised the Chinese. I mean, move in the direction of a very functional, very capable state that includes people of different national origins and different faiths, and strengthening that, not moving away from it, is perhaps India's biggest overall strength in a long-term rivalry with China. But other than that, I would say China, given what's happening now within the region and China's rise, it is very clear to me that India has to play a greater regional role on its own terms, not as a member of the Quad, beneficial as I think that is overall for Indian national security, or in terms of links, building further links with United States. India has to go further in realizing that it is not just in terms of its own significance and power, but in the eyes of others, first and foremost the Chinese, a very significant regional power for this region that I tried to define in our conversation today, Sushant. And that means having a much more active, much more outreach-oriented policy with regard to Southeast Asia, which is going to be one of the key areas of rivalry over the next generation, and perhaps the most important region for economic growth, almost in a worldwide sense, in my view. It means building much stronger relations with Japan than what has been the case in the past. It means attempting, although this is going to be very difficult, alongside the rest of us, to point out to the Russians that they are really putting themselves in an impossible strategic position by throwing their weight so squarely behind China's rise as they are now doing. If you look at this, even half a generation from now, with the overall reduction that you see in Russian power overall, I think the problem is going to be that Russia is going to be so beholden to, so connected to China that it will almost be an appendix of Chinese power in the longer run. Is that really in Russia's own interest to do? And India, of course, has privileged relations with Russia that come out of the historical links with the Soviet Union in the past and with Russia in the early days of the new Russian Federation. So I think, these are the things that India needs to do. I think we need to see much more, in terms of security, much more of an Indian engagement abroad. And I know this goes against many of the traditions in terms of Indian foreign policy and security policy. But I think the time has come for a much more active role. I think even, if you think about this from a Beijing perspective, I think it is something that the Chinese in many ways expect to happen, right? And if it doesn't happen, if India pulls back more from these kinds of issues, I think that will lead to not to a more positive, but perhaps an even more negative view of the overall Indian position and strength in Beijing.
Yeah, Arne, there are 2 points on this. One is the Indian dependence on Russia, more than just historical ties, is also because of the very strong military relationship. Almost 60% of Indian military imports, spares, equipment, ammunition is still dependent on Russia. It's a very practical problem for the Indian military, Indian security establishment. And secondly, as far as the cooperation in the region, whether it's security or otherwise, India needs to develop that economic strength, the economic wherewithal. In the last few years, Indian economy has not done as well as it was doing a decade earlier. And I think those two challenges have constrained India to an extent in fulfilling what you would want it to do. But Arne, moving on to a slightly different issue, this border crisis, China used to classify it as a territorial dispute earlier, but in the last year or so, they have now classified it as a sovereignty issue. Does it make this more intractable and tough to solve? What does it really mean? Why would they now call it a sovereignty issue and not merely a territorial dispute?
So the reason why some of the language has changed, and this is not just true for India, though it's been highlighted with regard to the Indian border areas more than elsewhere, is because of the extreme emphasis that we now see in China on sovereignty overall and on territorial integrity, defined down to the last inch of what can be seen to be claimed as China's national territory. I mean, you see this in the South China Sea. You see it in a number of other disputes that are ongoing. It is a general change in terms of how the Chinese leadership sees itself, I think, with regard to its relations with others, and particularly on borders and territorial issues. I would warn against reading too much into it, though it is, of course, nailing one's flag to the mast in the sense that it means that no retreat is possible. That doesn't, in my view, mean that no negotiation is possible. I mean, I've been among the ones, as you know, who have been arguing that there is a potential for China and India to speak with each other, first and foremost with regard to reduction of tension. Lots of things that can be done in military terms, as you know better than me, along the disputed sectors of the border. But hopefully also over time go further than that. I mean, in my view, the border issues between China and India on the Chinese side are almost exclusively connected to the overall relationship between the two countries. And I think that's, in a way, that's where you could have a little bit of hope that this tension wouldn't get out of hand. But on the other hand, you know, that's also where the difficulties are, because, you know, it's very unlikely that the relationship between China and India overall is going to improve massively over the next half generation or so. And that means that it's very likely that the border tensions will not go away, and that they could even get worse. So my advice has always been on the Indian side to try to see what can be done to reduce tension, what can be done even to move towards some kind of you know, beyond what we have at the moment, meaningful negotiations, but be prepared for the opposite. And first and foremost, be aware, which it seems to me that some parts of Indian public opinion is not, that this issue is intimately connected to the overall relationship between India and China. And looking just at border issues in isolation makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, Arne, and the rise in Indian nationalism in the last few years makes it even more tougher, more difficult. You know, your prognosis actually, holds even more strongly. Arne, also I wanted to ask you, because you have observed PLA for so many years, almost decades now. How has the PLA evolved over the years? What are the biggest areas of improvement in your view?
I mean, they've evolved in terms of increased capacity, as you know, in almost every area. I mean, what stands out is, of course, that China now has an ocean-going navy, which it didn't, in effect, have up to, you know, a decade ago, and making tremendous progress in terms of how they build and construct and equip that navy. Its missile forces have developed beyond what most people in the military field thought was possible within a relatively short period of time, giving them a position, particularly with regard to the Western Pacific, which goes much beyond what most people would have in mind. And of course, this has very immediate impact on the Taiwan situation, for instance, in terms of a change in the sort of balance of power overall. If you think specifically about the relationship with India, and particularly about the border areas, of course, you know, anyone who has eyes to see have seen how Chinese strategy and tactics have developed in terms of the border clashes. This is not just with regard to equipment and in terms of military technological capabilities, although some of those are very important as well, including surveillance possibilities that were not there before, but also in terms of pure tactics. I mean, in terms of how the PLA, but particularly the PLA elite forces and the border forces are strengthened in terms of how they can carry out tactical operations. That's a world away from what was the case, you know, half a generation ago. It's really very striking. I mean, how that has developed. And I know that on the Indian side, of course, one is looking very, very closely at this, but this is an important aspect of the relationship. Be aware of this tremendous increase in Chinese capabilities that we've seen over the last few years.
And finally, Arne, I know you knew President Xi's father rather reasonably well. Any personal anecdotes about President Xi or his family that you find very fascinating and which you can share with our listeners?
So I met old Xi on a couple of occasions. I wouldn't say I know him well, but I met him. Struck me as very different from his son. Probably, at least in part, because he had a different position. He was known as a bit of a troubleshooter and go-getter in terms of CCP policy. He had been purged from the leadership, it is said, 5 times, which is almost by CCP, in the CCP calculation, almost a world record or a Chinese record. Deng Xiaoping used to say that he had been purged 3 times. Old Xi was purged 5 times. So he was quite a controversial figure within the party, very outspoken, very, very direct, but also immensely respected because of what he had been able to achieve. I never met President Xi, his son, and I think he comes across as much more of a consensus figure, much more as someone who is trying to represent the different groups within the party and do so well. In terms of political views, it's really very hard to say. I mean, this is one of the challenges, I think, with regard to President Xi, is that he seems to come out of where the party consensus is at the higher levels. I have no doubt that he influences it, but it's very hard. I mean, unlike his father, who on some of these issues really wore his heart on his sleeve, it's very difficult to see how the trajectory of President Xi's thinking actually is with regard to this, except in the most general of senses. That might be the kind of leader that China is looking for at the moment. Is it good for China in the longer run? I'm not so sure about that. I actually think, a bit different from what many of our China experts are arguing, that having a leader who is able to make personal decisions that break out of the kind of framework that has been established. I mean, a leader like Deng Xiaoping or Xi Jinping's father, for that matter, might be more called for at the moment at the top of the Chinese party than the kind of very careful, do not rock the boat, consensus-oriented, but still very strong arm kind of policy that Xi stands for. We have to find out more, and hopefully we will in a positive sense, what Xi, particularly in terms of China's domestic policy, really wants to stand for and be remembered for, except increased authoritarianism and increased repression and increased conflict with the United States and others externally. What is the positive message of this? And that we've yet to see, I think.
But we have to live with President Xi. He doesn't seem to be going anywhere, notwithstanding your wish. And thank you so much, Arne. This was enlightening, and I look forward to hosting you in India, pandemic permitting.
It has been a great pleasure, Sushant. And it always is to speak with you, and I look forward to my next visit.
Thank you to our listeners for listening to this podcast. For more information on our work, follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and log on to our website at www.cprindia.org.